Laurie Spencer is another longtime colleague of mine. She's a journalist, a broadcaster, an analyst, a television personality, but she's no to NATO, no to war, and she is welcome here. Laurie, Patrick peerlessly described there the midnight Nuremberg rally that went on just north of where you are in Ottawa. Were you surprised by it, first of all? Did you see it in real time as a tremendous gaffe, or did you see it as a logical conclusion of the path that Western leaders and Trudeau in the van have been on?
Well, first of all, George, thanks for having me back. Yes, we were on the air live Friday on Maverick News. I'm the American correspondent for Maverick News. Maverick News is a Canadian news network based in Ontario, and we were carrying live the stream of Zelensky's visit to the parliament. And when the speaker introduced Yaroslav Hunka, he introduced him as someone who was fighting the Russians in World War II, and that gave me pause. Yeah, because I know who fought the Russians in World War II, and I said, wait a minute. But we were live on the air, so I didn't want to say anything until I'd researched this man, and I spent Saturday finding out who he was, and yes, he was in the Waffen-SS, Galicia Division. So we went with the story on Sunday. And as far as I'm aware, I think we were the first news outlet in Canada to report that story. Strangely enough, the mainstream media was silent about it until it went viral on social media, and there was so much public outrage, rightly so. So yeah, that's how we found out. We had it live on the air when it happened. But in my research,
it's big news, Laurie, on social media. But did it make the mainstream?
Not in Canada, and it took a while in the United States as well. There was a strange delay in reporting that story. Gee, I wonder why.
You see, that's peculiar to me, Laurie, because I don't want to be offensive to Americans, but one of our pet hates over here is the proliferation of Second World War films which show John Wayne winning the war, show Americans winning the war, which for a start they didn't enter until it was 2 years old. And secondly, it was the Russians, not the Americans, that won the war. But these are Western societies for whom the Second World War is apparently important. The defeat of Hitler is the great achievement of 20th century government in Western countries. And yet, here was a member of the Five Eyes, a British Commonwealth country, a member of NATO, a leading liberal progressive prime minister, hailing a mass murdering SS man. And yet none of them, certainly in Britain, none of the mainstream media have made this an issue at all.
Shameful. Absolutely shameful. And there's a lot of scrubbing of the internet also happening right now. And as you just said, the Canadian Parliament is looking to strike the whole thing from the record. So something I found in my research, and it's what I wanted to bring to you today, and this has been very much covered up in the news, is that Yaroslav Hunka wrote his own memoir, and he published it on the internet. It was a blog that he published in 2011, and he told his story of what it was like in World War II and why he joined the Waffen-SS. I wanted to read you a few selected excerpts, if I may, because
Please.
I think this blog is about to go away. It's going to be memory hold, and I want to read these excerpts into the permanent record so that if the blog goes away, his words will live forever. He writes, the Polish army and the civilian population are fleeing along the road in the direction of Berezan in a continuous stream, and German planes are catching up with them from time to time. And here he's describing his youthful fantasies about killing Polish civilians. He says, every day we impatiently looked in the direction with the hope that these mystical German knights who give bullets to the hated cowards will appear. He's, of course, writing of the Nazis. He says, in my 6th grade, out of 40 students, there were 6 Ukrainians, 2 Poles, and the rest were Jewish children of refugees from Poland. We wondered why they were running away from such a civilized Western nation as the Germans. He goes on to describe the Nazi invasion of Ukraine, of course, Operation Barbarossa. He writes, in July of 1941, the German army occupied our town. We greeted the German soldiers with joy. He writes of Hitler, the new liberator of the Ukrainian people. Führer Hitler reigned over our land. Portraits of Hitler in a long overcoat with a raised cowl covering his menacing face, with small, as if artificially attached whiskers under his sharp nose, with the inscription, Hitler, Liberator, hung in each classroom in every school. He writes of the OUN, the notorious OUN. He says the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists organized its cells in our local gymnasium at our school and embraced many young people. I had just turned 16, and the next 2 years were the happiest years of my life. That's how he describes being under Nazi occupation. He says, I had no idea what I experienced in those 2 years would fill me with love in such a way that it would be enough for me for the rest of my life. And then in 1943, Hunka's dream of joining the Waffen-SS came true. He says, the thought of turning those beasts in human form with a red star on the forehead became real. That's how he writes of the Red Army. He says, time and events said that it was my generation's turn to follow in the footsteps of its predecessors, and it went for the sake of the idea of cathedral Ukraine. Our roads were different because that was the fate of our stateless people. At the call of the OUN, many joined the ranks of the UPA. Others, at the call of the Ukrainian Central Committee, went as volunteers to the Galishnia Division. In 2 weeks, 80,000 volunteers joined the division, including many students of my school. None of us asked what our reward would be, what our provision would be, or even what our tomorrow would be. We felt our duty to our native land, and we left. He talks about how the Red Army mowed down his division. He says, many students of my local gymnasium died a heroic death in the ranks of the UPA in the Galishnia Division. Of the Holocaust, he says very little. He says, I do not want the reader to understand that my entire generation was ideologically motivated and spiritually conscious. In a bag of healthy apples, there are also some rotten ones. It will depend on the relationship between those two qualities of apples in the course of a generation. Of course, on the last day of the war, the Galishnia Division broke off contact with the Czechoslovak Republic and surrendered to the British Army, he writes in his blog. And then he gets a lucky break when he was found to be useful, most likely by British military intelligence. He writes, in a prisoner of war camp in Italy, I met many boys from various villages of my region, and he recounts that many of his fellow prisoners were old friends from the OUN and the UPA. It was like a reunion party of his former Waffen-SS Galicia division. Hunka remained unapologetic in his 2011 online memoir, still proud of his service in the Waffen-SS and still very smitten with Ukrainian nationalist fanaticism. He writes of it as some kind of twisted mission from God and bizarrely compares himself to the Jews who fled to Israel after the war. Now, he fails to mention, of course, that the Jews were fleeing persecution while he was fleeing prosecution when he immigrated to Britain and later Canada. He says, I think that it was God's will that we should travel around the world like the tribe of Israel, tell the world about Ukraine, and 45 years later come to it with help. Our mission was difficult, he says, because the world knew very little about us, and what it did know, it was falsely presented by our neighbors. End quote.
Well, it is chilling indeed. You can see why they want to memory hole it. The SS in toto was declared by the Nuremberg Tribunal to be a criminal organization.
That's right.
Ipso facto, he was therefore a criminal. But he was deemed to be useful. And useful he turned out to be, I'm sure, until last week, until his unmasking, uncorked all over again the incipient hatred of people for fascism, for Nazism, and the bringing back of memories which had faded too far of the crimes of these people. Babi Yar, the mass murder of more than 100,000 people, most of them Jews, in pits, where they were alive and then they were slaughtered in the pit in which they were then entombed forever, was carried out by these Ukrainian nationalists, these very people. Hunka may even have been there. Why not? It was his division that carried it out. Laurie Spencer, as always, thank you very much indeed for that.